Zainab Mohseni is joining us now. She is first-generation African-American running for Congress from the 11th District. I just have to say I was inspired by her presentation on the very first call where I joined this crazy group who's gotten all this together today. Boy, am I lucky to be a part of this group. And she inspired me the first call that I saw. So that was awesome. And today she's going to be telling us about the military-industrial complex and police brutality. Certainly something we need to talk about in this moment. And thanks everybody for being a part. I'm sorry we didn't get to more questions. Go for it, Zainab.
Hi, thank you so much for having me here. As Susan said, my name is Zainab Mohseni. I'm a congressional candidate in Virginia's District 11. We got in at the tail end of this discussion, but I love the speak of intersectionality, and that's what we're here to do. So part of my political education happened through racial justice and social justice groups. So I am very continuing to learn and aware of the intersectionality of systems of oppression that exist in this country and how that impacts the global community. I support Medicare for All, the Green New Deal, a livable minimum wage. I am advocating for immigrant justice, educational equity, and racial justice and equity. And today is a beautiful day to talk about the military-industrial complex because and how it intersects with police brutality, because we're in the middle of a racial justice movement, and also today's World Refugee Day, and as a refugee, I think that it's a very good time for us to be talking about this. So a little bit about my background. I am from Afghanistan. I was born in Afghanistan, so my entire life has been dictated by the military-industrial complex, by the foreign policy that has been made in the U.S., and we will go more into about the interconnectivity of police brutality in the U.S. and white supremacy, and how it intersects with the military-industrial complex. So we wanted to make this a little bit more interactive. So I'm going to let Charlie introduce themselves, and we'll do an introductory activity.
Hi, everybody. I'm Charlie. I'm Zainab's campaign manager. Zainab asked me to be a part of this as well, just so that we could have multiple people and make it kind of a conversation between us and all of you as well. So yeah, my name's Charlie. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm gonna give it back off to Zainab to introduce our introduction activity.
Okay, awesome. So I think that I want to make this kind of a disclaimer as a person who's been a victim of war and has family members who have experienced violence through war, and that we're asking people to take 5 minutes to type your how individually war has impacted your life, and whether or not we realize it, all of our lives have been touched by war, and we live in a country that has been at war continuously, even if we don't see it here on our land, with other countries for at least the past decade, the past 2 decades actually. And I wanted everybody to take about 5 minutes to write down how war has impacted. And like I said, I understand that this, some people may not feel comfortable talking about it, and this might be triggering for some people. So please be cautious of your feelings, and we want to make sure that we're being cognizant of that. So if you wanted to put it in the chat, any experience you have of in connection with war, and then we'll talk about the history and the connection of it after our discussion.
Yeah, and also, so if you want to take 5 minutes, just write down your personal experiences with war. You don't even have to share it in the chat if you want to, just so it could be a moment of personal reflection. Mm-hmm. If that's something that's really you don't feel super comfortable sharing, and then we can talk a little bit about, I share like our different experiences and how it's touched our lives, and then we can go into kind of like then we're going to do a little bit more of like a conversation about the history of the military-industrial complex and how it relates to policing, and then we'll have kind of like a space for reflection at the end. Yeah.
So for this moment, we're gonna turn off our camera just to give everybody a minute. So if everybody wants to do that, we'll be back it's 6:52 now, so it's 6:57. Okay, so we're back. I will share my experience of what war has done to my family. So my family had to flee Afghanistan because Afghanistan has been in war for about 40 years. I think that there were a lot of civil wars going on, and then the Russian influence and the US involvement in that, which created the Taliban. And then there was war by the Taliban. And then when the US went in 2001, and it has been at war, and I feel like it still continues to be. So the Afghan people, and my family included, has seen poverty, has seen violence, has seen has a lot of generational trauma because of the experience of war in Afghanistan.
Yeah. And so I'm not sure people can see me, but
They can.
so my like experience of how war has touched my life is very different from Zainab's, because I've never been like a personal victim of war, never been on a battlefield or anything like that. But I know that like I grew up in a small rural conservative town, and that a lot of people there were involved in the military. And so there's a lot of veterans. There are a lot of people whose main goal in life is to go and join the military, and that created a really big culture of kind of like hyper nationalism, hyper masculinity in my hometown. And so a lot of kind of like the learned behaviors that people got from their parents as being part of like the military, like kind of like trickled down to their kids. And just like the presence, the military had a very, recruiting had a very big presence in our community. There's a lot of, talks about what it meant to be a veteran, but a lot of those were like, infused with like racism and misogyny and homophobia. And like as a queer person growing up in that space, there was a lot of that homophobia that was like taken out on people like me who were different, who didn't have that kind of like nationalistic kind of like sentiment. And so like I think that the culture of war and nationalism and military as it exists in the United States like impacts a lot of people here, even if we haven't seen war ourselves. And we have about, I wanted to take 10 minutes, so we have to get on to the next thing, getting into kind of like our historical conversation starting at 7:10. But whoever wants to share a little bit for a couple minutes about how war has impacted their lives, you can go ahead and start sharing that as well.
Again, if you feel comfortable, please, I thought I saw that you shared some on the chat. If you wanted to tell us more about it, if you feel comfortable, please do so.
Or anyone else who feels
Or anyone else, yeah. I just saw Salma's comments.
I can go, but I'm also host, so if anyone else wants to go, please let me know. And also stop me if I go too long. But yeah, so I put some of it in the chat. So firstly, I'm half French and half African, and I grew up in the Middle East. My father is a journalist. Originally, he was an oil journalist. I grew up in Kuwait, and when we knew the invasion was going to start, we left. We lived all those years in Saddam's shadow, but when we knew American troops were going to come, we had to go. And so I grew up in Abu Dhabi, very safe, but my father was a war journalist, so I saw him on TV with bombs going off in the background, and they tried to shelter me from all this, but I was the oldest and figured some of it out. But another thing was, in my school, I was the really privileged one. In Abu Dhabi, there's a lot of people who are Palestinian. And every summer, I never knew if they were coming back or not, because we didn't know if they were going to start another war. And we didn't know they'd be allowed out again, or if they would live for like every summer, all my Palestinian and Lebanese friends. I was so afraid they wouldn't come back. And that was hard. And the fact is, like, a lot of people in my school had, like, despite all the privilege we had, because we were in the school where you were amongst the most privileged. But my story was not exceptional. Like, it's like being Arab is just that has just become part of being Arab. And like, the other thing was, back home, we talked about the reality of the war, which was that sometimes American troops did not do good things, and sometimes American troops did not represent America well. And that meant hearing stories of, my father begging with American troops, don't bomb that office, don't bomb that office, it's an Al Jazeera office, and they bombed them anyway, but that wasn't reported here. And then when I came here for high school, and Chelsea Manning came out with her video, and people called her a traitor, it was like something that we all knew back home was a secret here. All those videos, all those times American troops, like Abu Ghraib was not the exception people think it was. And then like going back a little further in my family history, like I said, I'm half African and half French for obvious reasons that can cause issues. From the day my brother found out that my French grandfather served in the French army because he was drafted and served in Algeria, to the day he died, he refused to speak to him because that meant my grandfather was a colonizer, and to my brother, we are African first. And don't get me wrong, I love Africa, and what happened in Algeria was terrible. But I also saw the nuance of, he was drafted, he didn't have I wish he had ran to Belgium or something else, but that's not what happened. That's not what most people did. And so that was also a split in my family, coming from the, being half French and being half African. And that's something that's come up since, where people, like, a lot of my friends who are of Algerian origin or North African origin, when they find out my grandfather was in Algeria, it's I don't know how to describe it. It's weird. But anyway, I've talked for like 4 of the 10 minutes. So if anyone else wanted to speak, I should probably let them go. But because I could talk about war all day long, and like there's so many more things I could say. Who next wanted to speak? I'm sorry, because I'm also a host, so I have to like pin your video.
Hey, Salma, do you mind if I say a few things?
Yes, go for it.
Well, I'm for those who don't know me, my name is Jerry Cantrell, and I'm a professor of political science, and I've spent much of my adult life working with the military, both the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, and the Marines. And I've lived in the Middle East. I've lived in Turkey, northern and southern Turkey, and some of the things that I simply can't talk about, because according to my jobs and everything, if I would actually open up and say some of the things that I've seen, I can't get it. It's federal crime. Okay, I would be penalized. Okay, so I can't say certain things, but I can say that one thing, that I help write the resolution for the state convention condemning potential genocide of the Kurds. And I have, as I said, I've lived in the Middle East. I've lived in Ankara, Turkey, and I've lived also in Adana, Turkey, and I've seen southern Turkey. I've seen the problems of perceived terrorism on one side of the border, perceived terrorism on the other side of the border, because of where I've gone. And I can tell you that I've literally been off the coast of Lebanon, and I've seen our ships sit there and watch as buildings fall down and as people die. And there was nothing we could do, because we were not right according to our policy. The captains would tell me that they could not do anything because of international law, and also because of our national policy, right? We could not go in and stop these innocent deaths that were going on, because it would involve the Soviets, it would involve other countries, and very concerning diplomatic relations. But I've also seen evacuees, coming off at the period of time, and it tears your heart out. I mean, I stayed on, one ship, and I was given an award on the ship because you know, was in danger zone, that sort of thing. But I also talked to the Kurds and others that were suffering. And there's no doubt about it. In that part of the world, right now, there is an incredible human horror that's going on every single day. And there is a war in Afghanistan, the longest in American history. And there's virtually no discussion of it in America. The news media says nothing about these horrors, about these dying people and the suffering. And I'm pleased to see that the resolution, you know, that I offered was, you know, was amended to include other nation state, you know, and groups into it. And it will be, if it passes tomorrow, it will, you know, go to the National Convention. But these horrors and this hell and this suffering is unimaginable. And I was appalled when our president just turned his back on the Kurds after fighting for, you know, for freedom and liberty. And I'm appalled at the, now I've been in Bethlehem, I've been in Jerusalem, I've spent time, I've seen tanks roll up and down the streets and, you know, with no concern at all for human being lives and for children that were in there to clear the roads. And I thought this was uncivilized, supposedly by a civilized country, you know, Israel. So as I said, I've seen how you go into Israel, and on one side, right, you would be by the Wailing Wall, right, or you go to Haifa or someplace. If you look at the Jewish part of the communities, it was Europeanized, but if you lived at the Arab world, it was suffering, not proper sanitation and other things that the people needed in those areas. So I've not directly been, you know, involved in suffering, but I've seen the suffering. And anybody that has any sense of humanity and a love for their caring for their fellow man, this is not the country we used to be. This media simply ignores the human suffering in the world, and I am simply ashamed of it. I hate to say that about my own country that I love, because it is a good country. It is a caring country. But as I said, for suffering folks of your nationality and others, my heart is with you, my soul is with you, and I pray to God that we can stop this. And in the future, have a much better world. Thank you.
May I speak?
Sure.
Okay, my name is Dan Adkins, and I have a very different story in that both of my fathers were in the military. My biological father ended up a Marine, and he ended up fighting in World War II and died leading a platoon on Iwo Jima. And I got to know the people in his company. And on Iwo Jima, the average rifle company would have something like 85% casualties, dead and wounded among riflemen, and maybe 94 if you had a flamethrower or whatever. So I have some experience there. But I'm also doing some writings and bring up an issue which I'm probably in outer space on this, but one of the most bizarre things I've seen was visiting Portugal in 1975, where for the first time in human history, a military got together with the guerrillas, and they ended up overthrowing a dictatorship and introducing democracy. I would love to see that happen again, but that was just very unique. But in my writings, one of the things I've been focusing on now is in the attack on Lafayette Square, I've been trying to let know that if you're in the military or the government, you're supposed to swear to the Constitution. The First Amendment is in the Constitution, which gives you freedom of protest. And so I was trying to introduce the idea that if you are a soldier or, I guess, a policeman, you have the right to not to follow an illegal order. And the Washington Post didn't want to publish my letter to the editor, and neither did the New York Times. The other aspect which I've been talking about, which I've talked in my Green New Deal, is a lot of the militaries have a lot of educational and engineering capability. And why can't, I'm all for defunding much of the military to some degree, but there are a lot of resources there. and they can be used for climate change. But I almost am afraid to say that, since so many of my comrades are just more interested in abolishing things and rather than repurposing it. But my article is that if the military is going to be doing
Excuse me, Dan. I'm so sorry.
okay, no problem.
We've already gone 2 minutes over, and I know Zainab wanted to move on with the.
I apologize.
Well, thank you so much for sharing, everyone. Thank you, Selma. Thank you, Jerry, for sharing your experiences with war. And I think that one thing we wanted to highlight is that the traumas of racism are very similar to the traumas of war. And we wanted to talk a little bit about the connection between the military-industrial complex and the police brutality against Black people in America.
And yeah, thank you so much, Selma, for your vulnerability and sharing like your experiences and your perspective. And I think that that's really important. And I think that, you know, what several points of the various stories that all of you told point to is that, you know, in the United States, the way that people view war is generally very different from people who are living in impacted areas. And a lot of that has to do with media coverage. It has to do with the way politicians talk about war. It has to do with the way that the military spends in our social systems in order to create an image of itself that's very different from its image on the ground. And I think that it's important for us to be cognizant of the fact that, like, yes, we are still in, one of the longest wars in US history, and it's getting very little media attention. So just to keep that in mind, that we are a country at war, as we speak. And like almost, for younger people like me, it's been almost my entire life that we've been, at war. Anyway, so we're going to do a little bit of history discussion right now. We're going to talk a little bit about history of the development of the police and how it connects with militarization. So historically, the police have been a governmental tool to maintain existing forms of social, political, and economic power at the expense of marginalized communities. So throughout the South, a lot of the first police forces birthed out of after the Civil War, after slave patrols. And the slave patrols existed throughout the antebellum period as a way to surveil Black people and to enact violence on Black people who resisted white supremacy. And as slave patrols, turned more into a policing force after the Civil War, there was also collaborations between those policing forces and white supremacist hate groups like the KKK. And they often worked in collaboration with police departments to enact violence upon Black people and maintain the racist societal structure. And then, in other parts of the country as well, police, were beginning to, pop up. And a lot of like the first uses of the police were to surveil unions and immigrant communities and break up the power of working class people and immigrants. And a lot of this, about, surveilling, about enacting, police brutality, about, breaking up power of marginalized communities, led to a lot of, distress, like a lot of distress among these marginalized communities towards like the state and the forms of violence the state used to maintain the social and political power of the state. In 1966, James Baldwin captured the feeling of many Black communities when he wrote that Black communities were occupied territory because of the brutality of the police forces in those communities. And this comparison was especially apt because many people in the U.S. could see the parallels between the U.S. military's violence in Vietnam and the violence enacted on Black communities and protesters in the U.S. And then after 1966, policies such as the war on drugs, the war on crime, through the Nixon and Reagan and Clinton eras, allowed the government to further militarize police officers and create SWAT teams. And it's important to know that SWAT teams actually have done very little to reduce the use of drugs in their communities, but they do enact violence on residents and they erode trust in police departments.
Yeah, and that continued. So during the Bush era, the war on terror and policing started. So after 9/11, the US government greatly expanded its military presence and power abroad. The Patriot Act and the creation of the Department of Homeland Security and the expansion of the US military industrial complex for Iraq and Afghanistan wars allowed police departments to rapidly militarize. So the same weapons that are being used, that are are still being used to enact violence in Iraq and Afghanistan and are now becoming commonplace among U.S. police forces, and you can see that as they have been showing up to these protests and creating violence for protesters. So 1033, which is a DoD program that allows transfer of excess military equipment to police departments, spent $7 billion worth of, or they sent $7 billion worth of military arms to local police. And then, so departments don't have to pay for them, they only have to pay for the shipping of these weapons that are now being used on protesters. And the heightened nationalism that came out of 9/11 and the anti-Islam and anti-immigrant sentiments assisted in the creation of a military mindset among U.S. police forces.
And so there's also been this kind of, as policing has been in the post 9/11 era, where the war, like another one of the wars, we talked about the war on drugs, the war on crime, the war on terror, has allowed for the government to militarize the police a lot more, as Zainab was saying. And there's also been such a focus on like counterterrorism in policing. So after 9/11, the US intentionally sought for more ways to train the US to be more, US police forces to be more as like a counterterrorism unit. And so in this, where we see, you know, how the Israeli government pitched itself as an expert in counterterrorism, and the US began contracting with the Israeli government to begin teaching our police forces the techniques that the Israeli government had been using to maintain military control over Palestinian peoples, and how and using similar forces that the Israeli police force and military had been using to maintain control of their illegal settlements in Palestine. And so we can see a little bit, not only are weapons of war that are being used in places such as Iraq and Afghanistan now being used on the streets in the United States, the similar military kind of like techniques of like, you know, suppressing marginalized people that are used in by the, you know, the government of Israel are now also being used in the United States as well.
Go ahead.
You continue.
So we wanted to talk about the profiteering part of the military-industrial complex and how police is involved in that, and our current policing system also has become this business. So like the federal government has pumped trillions, and this was apparent by the Afghanistan papers that we, in Afghanistan alone, we've spent $2 trillion into the military-industrial complex over the past decades. And I think that the military contracting industry is extremely profitable. And as we can see, a lot of the people who live in the Northern Virginia area in District 11 are people who work for the military industrial industry. And I think that and a lot of legislatures have stocks, like personal stocks in the industry, including the incumbent that I'm running against. He has $400,000 of his own money invested. So every time there's a war, his stocks go up and he profits from that. So there are hundreds of thousands of high-paying jobs that depend on this industry. So we really have to ask ourselves some questions: that does this industry really make us safe, like be it the policing system or the military-industrial complex? And how much displacement, death, and hunger have we caused, not only in the US, but abroad? And I think a lot of it has been caused by our presence abroad and post 9/11. So and the excess military weapons from the wars are also making it worsening the crises that is the anti-Black sentiment in America. It's the xenophobia. It's worsening the anti-Muslim bigotry and the civil rights violations that are happening in the U.S. as we live through it. So I think that these are some really good questions to ask ourselves as people who live in the US, and how our policing system and our military industrial complex overlap with each other, and how much damage they cause, not only abroad, but also internally here at home for us. And we just wanted to take about the last 10 minutes of this to open up conversation and what some policy and societal changes that we can make to improve this crisis. We'll take about 3 minutes for and people could begin sharing. I just wanted to share my vision of what I think that we can start. I think this is also on my website, but I think that defunding the police, investing in our social services, investing in our education system, investing in mental health resources to help the communities that are over-policed, which tend to be Black and Brown communities, which tend to be lower income communities. There's more structural changes needed and investments needed in social services. And I think that, as we all know, policing does not help these communities. Police, in turn, cause violence and murder Black people for being Black.
And also kind of another part of that is like thinking about like, what do we do with this military industrial complex, which is something that, you know, even Eisenhower warned the country about in his like departing address as president is, you know, what's going to happen to our country if war is always like tied to profit, right? And because there's so many, you know, politicians, there's so many, politicians who are connected to the military-industrial the military-industrial complex because they make money off of it. There are, you know, they have their own lobbyist industry. They have, you know, hundreds of thousands of people with jobs in that industry. Like, how can we transition away from this very profitable complex and, you know, create a better, you know, society? We think, you know, we also need to get rid of corruption. We need to get rid of big money. We need to get big money out of politics. We can't. We need like our politicians to divest from the war industry so that if people in Congress have the power to, you know, say whether or not the United States wages war, that they can now be, you know, making profits off of war. And so those are a couple ideas that we have, but please take a few minutes to, you know, think about, you know, what other kind of stuff that we can do as a society. And then we can, finish that up and have a little bit of a reflection at the end.
Can I say something?
Please do.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I was in college during the Vietnam War, and we had the draft. And so the guys in my class, you know, had to worry about getting drafted into the war and all that. And I was kind of privileged, so I didn't really know many people who did go to the Vietnam War, but I do remember seeing one guy the last time, and then next thing I heard about him, he had died in the Tet Offensive, you know. But the main thing is about the draft. And then they ended the draft, and I think we got to be so we didn't have that much invested in the wars we were doing everywhere. And I remember being worried about the draft when my sons got of age. And well, actually, no, they stopped the draft. That's right. They stopped the draft. And then they were talking about bringing it back again. And I remember my gut-wrenching feeling of, oh no, I don't want my sons to get drafted. But at the same time, I knew that was the way to make us responsible for the wars we were doing, you know? And so I think if we had the draft back, we would all be thinking about these wars that we're doing. And back in 68, when I was in college, we had those big, demonstrations against the war and all that. And that was partly because we were all in it together. And now we're not. It's a paid job to go to war.
Right.
So I just wanted to bring that up.
I think that that's such a great point, is because it is usually like lower income communities who get recruited to be on the front lines. They tend to be the soldiers. They tend to be the recruitment happen within these communities that are being marginalized within our society to go abroad and risk their lives. And people, I think that this happens all the time, where we salute the veterans for protecting us, but they come home, they lack healthcare, they lack mental health services, they lack all these necessary resources to help them come back from the PTSD that they experience.
So yeah, I can speak to, like, in my experience, like I was saying at the beginning, growing up in like a rural lower income community, that like military presence and military recruiting people was everywhere. And so like I know, and the military explicitly, knows who they're reaching out to, right? And so like they know that they're wanting to target low-income people. They know that they're wanting to target communities of color. They're wanting to target rural communities, places where they think that, and the specific way that they sell themselves is a way to get out of poverty, right? And so I know that a lot of my classmates who wanted to go to college but didn't think they could afford it, their only way that they felt that they could do, that they could have social mobility was by going through the military. And so I know so many of my classmates have been, part of the military because of that, but I recognize that that's not the reality for a lot of other people who grow up in kind of more affluent areas. And so I think that it's also about, forcing our societal systems to be accountable and to, pay attention to these communities that, that are at the front end of these kinds of crises as well. Communities of color, low-income communities, communities where there's not a lot of path for social mobility. Okay, we only have a couple minutes left. Anybody else have any final thoughts that they want to share, final reflections?
Yes, I would like to share some of my experiences. I'm from the generation that has experienced the Vietnam War, but not in Vietnam, here in America. And I have friends who have whose characters and personalities has been destroyed. Their lives have been destroyed. And they've been homeless for decades. I just bumped into one of them a few years back when I visited Colorado and Denver, and we almost cried together. And that even made me a stronger Democrat than other. However, I did live 5 wars. The 56 war, the 67 war, the 73 war, the Yemen war, the Iraq war, and I've seen the worst that I've seen was in the 73 war. I was a doctor in a major central hospital, a huge university hospital in Egypt, and the injured soldiers were coming in bus loads. They would drop 200 on the sidewalk and leave to get others. And we probably many of us haven't slept 10 or 12 days all straight through. So it's a horrible thing to think that we can dominate the world by force or by the military. And unfortunately, the military industrial complex has grown ever since, and there's no end to it.
Yeah.
I've been to the Iraq War, and when I was with at the embassy for a while, and then with the multinational forces, and once I saw burned Iraqis in villages who were civilians, had nothing to do with anything related to the war, burned, and they were still alive, and there wasn't any hospital to care for them.
Mm-hmm.
Nonetheless, I had my salary was $110,000,
Wow.
and I resigned, and I could not bear being related to that war. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
so much for sharing. Yeah.
I know we have to wrap up,
Hello.
but can I say one last thing before?
So giving until 7:32. So Salma, please share.
Oh yeah, the next workshop's mine anyway. So, I understand that there's a lot of people who join the military for financial reasons, and I think, as progressives, like, let's not shame people for the financial situation they're in, but there's also the Blackwaters of the world, whose CEO and his kids happen to go to school with my siblings, and are overpaid and do terrible things.
Yeah.
And one time when he got drunk, he showed my brother's friends pictures of people's brains who he had blown out, civilians in Iraq, saying like basically that he could do anything. So as much as I understand there's you know, some people who joined the military because they have to, there's also this other Blackwater and stuff like that that needs to stop.
Exactly.
That man is a monster, and I've seen him like on American TV, and he seems nice and everything, but when he gets drunk, like there's something wrong with that man, and that man was given free range in Iraq.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And there's so many of these horrible things that happen that are never reported in the media when they should be.
Yeah, I think that's what it is. It's just like we recognize that it's created this system where poor people, in order for working class people, in order for them to get social mobility, have to join the military. And I think that these systems can be broken down, and the money that we invest in the military industrial complex can be invested within our society to curb that. So that's our time. Thank you so much for having us. Thank you for having this very important conversation with us. And please make sure that we all are striving to create a just and equitable world for everybody. And thank you so much for letting us be here.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Zainab.
Thank you for the courage to run for office.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's so great.
Thank you guys so much.
You want to vote for Zainab or phone bank for her this weekend?
Definitely. So coming up next, we have actually got 2 workshops happening. One is going to be right here on this channel, and you are welcome to okay, that's funny. It shows me as being Arthuretta or something. I don't know. Okay, there I am. One of them is going to be right here on this channel. It's going to be Salma leading us in the Resolution Authors Workshop. The other is the New Paradigm on Palestine Workshop. And that is, I'm going to drop the link for that right here in the chat. So if you are here for that, grab that Zoom link and go over to that other meeting. We just had so much good stuff today that we were not able to fit it in all in series. We had to run at least one in parallel. So so if you guys are all set with that, just either grab that link and go over to the New Paradigm in Palestine, or stick around here for the workshop on the Resolutions Authors. Okay, Salma, take it away.